Well, hello, welcome to this lesson in our ongoing series of lessons on creating an RPG game in Game Maker. When we left off last time, we had created different states for our player to allow our player to walk around and to swing his sword, and we also set up a collision between the sword and the plants, and learned about a bunch of scripts that we could use for detecting collisions between the sword and other objects and so on. And we created hitboxes that appeared as we needed them to. So we are all set up at the moment to bring in some enemies and do a similar approach to creating one or more states for our enemies, and then we'll ultimately set up the ability for our enemies to move around and attack our player. So let's do that. In order to continue with this lesson, you will need to create a set of sprites for your enemy. I would encourage you to use the same free sprite sheet creation website that we use to create our player. You can choose. There's like a skeleton and an orc, and there are a few different items that you can use for your enemy. And just like you did with the player, you're going to want to bring in those sprites and then divide them up into individual frames, create and name different animations with the enemy sprites, following the exact same pattern you did with the player. So I'm not going to do that in the video. You need to do that on your own, but I will have you pause and go off and do that, or continue to watch and you'll see how I named them and brought them in here. Alright, I brought all of mine in. I created a skeleton looking enemy, and I gave him a long spear, which will be used for an attack. And in terms of naming them, I followed the exact same naming scheme I used for the player. The player I called S player run right, run up, run down, and then attack right, up and down. So here I have S enemy run right, S enemy run down, S enemy run up, and then S enemy attack down, right, and up. And there's also an enemy dead sprite, like so. In my sprites for my enemy, I'm going to use with the enemy object the enemy run down sprite as the default sprite, and I'm going to use the collision mask on enemy run down as the collision mask for all of my enemies. So on the S enemy run down sprite, I have modified the collision mask so that it doesn't cover the character's head, just like we did with the player. I'll bring it way down here, and I brought the bottom up so it's near the feet. And for the origin point on each of the enemy sprites, I placed it just like I did with the player, near the feet at the bottom, and I just kind of eyeballed it, and I may need to adjust it a little bit as I go along, but we'll leave it set as I've got it here. So you'll need all of this stuff before you can continue on, and I've got all my stuff going, so I'll continue on. In creating the enemy, I'm going to follow a mostly similar set of steps to what we did when we created the player, but with some important differences. First difference is that in order to allow for the possibility that you may have more than one type of player, or excuse me, more than one type of enemy, even though we won't do that in this set of video lessons and in class, I'm going to create an enemy parent that will contain all of the common behaviors that I want all of the enemies to have, and then I'll make children of that parent enemy and then modify those children to vary depending on what kind of enemy they are. And then that will allow you, when you're creating your own RPG game, separate from class, separate from this assignment, if you want to add other enemies, it'll make life a little bit easier. So I'm going to create a enemy parent object that I will call O, enemy parent. And this object doesn't need to have a sprite. It's never going to exist in the room. It's just going to be in our list of resources. But it will have some events, all the things that we want to be in common for all of our enemies. So I'm going to have a create event, and in the create event, what I'm going to do, I'm going to set up enemies. And what are the things that I want to do? Well, I want to have all of my enemies be objects that move just like our player. And in our player, if you remember way back to some of our very first lessons, when we were setting up the player, I introduced you to a collection of movement scripts. And in fact, I think in our second video lesson, I walked through in excruciating detail what was going on in each of the movement scripts, and told you at that time that once you sort of understood what was going on, you never had to really look at them again. You could just use them. Well, now we start to see the benefit of having all of those movement scripts, and the benefit of having them designed to be kind of generic, so that we are now going to be able to use the same movement scripts that we use to set up and move our player to set up and move our enemies. So here in the parent enemy, I'm going to do the exact same thing I did with our player, which is to call this custom function called setup movement object. And in the setup movement object, if you look at the arguments that need to get passed to this, one is called friction. Remember that one is basically means it's going to slow down immediately, and if we go lower than 1 but higher than 0, then the object's friction will be less, meaning that as it slows down, it'll slow down a little bit more slowly. The second thing that we need to pass it is the amount of bounce. I'm going to say 0.5, so it's not going to retain its full energy. If it bounces into a wall, it's going to lose some energy. Then I need to say what is the thing I want to collide against. And just like the player, we're going to collide against the wall object. Okay, so that's just setting all that up. Even though I don't want to spend a lot of time, just a reminder, this is all the things that are happening in our setup movement object script. The main point to remember is that we are working with our own version of speed and direction. Okay, so that will set up our parent enemy. Another thing I want to do is to set up something called a hurt box. This is something we did in the one of our most recent lessons, where we had our player able to swing a sword and hit the grass, and we created a more sophisticated way of dealing with hitting the grass. It allowed us to decide later if we want to have an object be invincible at certain moments in the game or not, and that's essentially what this is allowing us to do. Here is we're setting up and hooking into that same system, and we're going to say that the parent enemy by default is not invincible, meaning that it will be able to be hurt by the player in our case. Then we'll set the image speed equal to 0 so that we don't animate initially. Then we're going to give our enemy some health. We'll set an instance variable named max health, and we'll set it to 2. Then we're going to set another instance variable called enemy health, and we're going to set that equal to max health. Why in the world why didn't we just say enemy health equals 2? Well, this allows us later on to alter the amount of health for the enemy in enemy health, but hold on to the idea of what its maximum health should be. So maximum health is something that won't vary, but enemy health will vary. Okay. Then we're going to create an instance variable called starting state. And we are going to say this is no one. So let me talk about what this means. We need to, just as we did on our player, decide which state is the object going to be in when it first appears in the room. With our player, we initialize the first state to be move, I think. Let's look back and remind ourselves. Go back to our player object. And in our create event, right down here at the end, we said state equals player move. And we had this instant variable called state, which then we check to see which event we should run. Okay. We're going to do something similar with our enemy, but we are going to add a little bit of sophistication to that, which will allow us to decide if we want the enemy object, a given enemy object, to be in any state when it starts. Because if it's in no state, just nothing will happen. It'll just sit there, right? And what we're going to use this concept for is that initially our enemy is going to not be in a state, and we're going to then run an alarm that will go off, and once the alarm goes off, we will transition our enemy from no state into some state, which will then cause the enemy to move around the room. Okay, so we're saying that in this case, we're creating an instance variable called starting state, setting it to no one, which basically means it's not in a state. Then we're going to set state. This is an instance variable, so this copy of state lives on the parent enemy, right? That means that even when we change the state, it's only going to change the state on the enemy. Meanwhile, there's a separate, totally independent instance variable called state that lives on the player. And we can change that one and it won't have any impact on the enemy. So they have the same name, but because they are instance variable, their scope is confined to the object where they live. The player state lives on the player, the enemy state lives on the enemy, or the children of this parent enemy. Right? And we're going to set the state equal to starting state, if I can spell it right. So it's the same idea. Here we have max health equal to 2, and then we're going to set the current health equal to what the max is. We have a starting state, which is set to nothing, no one, and then we're going to set state equal to that. So this doesn't change, but state later on will change. Then we are going to set up an enumeration for our enemy, just like we did for our player. Here on the parent, this enumeration is going to have only one state, hit. Remember that this is going to have a value of 0, and we'll make use of that when we add in some user events. Okay. And then when we create children of this parent, we can update the enumeration. Now this is tricky, right? Because enumerations are global in scope, and they contain values that are constant, meaning you can't change them. So that seems odd. How can we have children in which we have this enumeration with other items? Well, in the create event for the children, we can essentially override this enumeration. So we're not changing it exactly. In the creation of the children, we are creating an enumeration with the same name with different values, but we're not then later on trying to update it. So we are okay. All right. In terms of the setup, that's all we need. Now let's go into our step event for our parent enemy. And what are we going to do in the step event? Well, we're going to do something very similar to what we did in the player. We're going to update the depth of our enemy object to be -y, just like we did with the player. So as the enemy moves up the room or down the room, it will be drawn farther and farther behind other objects as it goes up, and farther sort of forward in front of other objects as it moves down the room. And you remember on the player we did this, event user state in our step event. But now there's a potential that our state is not pointing to anything, that there is no value in state. It's because we initialized it to no one, which means there is no value. So we need to check to make sure that there is a value. So if I say if state is not equal to no one, it must have been set to something else, somewhere else. So that will allow us to then run a user event that is associated with the value that's stored in state. Okay. What else do we need to do? Well, similar to what we did on the player, we are going to have an alarm. And this time what we're going to do in the alarm is we're going to say if I can spell this right, invincible equals false. Alright, so this is kind of a setup for something we're going to do a little later when we create our skeleton enemy, the child of this parent enemy. We're going to make it work so that sometimes that skeleton enemy will be invincible. It won't be able to be hurt. And other times it will not be invincible and it will be able to be hurt. So we will set an alarm elsewhere, and then when the alarm goes off, this is what we'll have it do. Okay. All right, what else do we need? Well, actually, we can set this up now so that we can make use of this invincible equals false. The implication is that we're going to set invincible equals to true somewhere. So let's do that now. And how we're going to do this is we're going to set up a collision between the parent enemy and our hitbox object. Now, thinking back, in our most recent lessons, we created a hitbox that appeared in the room when the player swings his sword. And it appears only briefly, and then it disappears. And in what we have set up thus far, that hitbox is able to destroy the grass and the tree. Well, obviously we want to also allow our hitbox that appears with the player's sword to be able to do damage to our enemy. And that's what we're going to set up here in this collision. And it's at this point that we're going to start making use of the somewhat elaborate collection of variables, arguments, that we passed into our custom create hitbox script. Remember that? We had all kinds of things, like 7 different arguments we were passing in, including knockback and strength and frames. Remember all of that? Now we'll start to make use of that. All right, so when there's a collision between the enemy and a hitbox, first we want to check to see if the enemy's already dead, because if the enemy's already dead, there's no point in doing anything. So we're going to say if enemy health, remember we just set that up in the create event, is less than or equal to 0, then exit. So if they've already been hit enough to die, essentially, then we don't need to do anything. We can exit out. We don't have to react to it being hit by a hitbox. Okay. Then we're going to do another check. We're going to say if hurt box, do you remember this? If hurt box object can be hit, other, then we'll do some stuff. Now, what in the heck does this mean? Now, remember, this hurt box object can be hit. We used that with our grass a minute ago. Basically, what this is saying is the, how do I say this? Is the enemy something that is able to be hit by the hitbox? Right? Remember that? And also, is it currently invincible or not? So what we did was, in this hurtbox object can be hit, we checked into our create hitbox to see if its list, its array of things that are able to be hit, includes the enemy or the child of any of these parent enemies. And we also check to see if the enemy is currently invincible or not, basically if it's not. And we return that information. So if it's not invincible and the thing that we have just hit with the hitbox is a target, it's a viable target, then we will return true. Okay? So if this is true, if the enemy is something that is able to be hit, then we're going to briefly make it invincible. Okay. Then we're going to set the alarm 0. And how long are we going to set it for? Oh, you can set it to be whatever you like, basically. Let's make it really brief. Let's just say it's 3. Okay, that may be too long. Then let's set the enemy health down some, and the amount that we're going to drop the enemy health is whatever the value is that we have recorded on the hitbox in its damage variable. So let me go back to our hitbox. When we created that, we see here you have this damage equals 1. Okay. And then when we instantiate the hitbox, we might increase this value. Remember when we did our create hitbox script, it's one of the things that we pass is how much damage we want to cause in the hit. So we're going to take whatever is stored in that value and we're going to decrease the enemy health that we just set here by that value. Okay. Then we're going to update our state to enemy.hit, which we've not done anything with, but we have in our setup here, here's our enumeration, enemy hit. Okay. We'll have to make this something occur when inside the enemy hit state. Then we're going to set a local variable called Knockback direction. And I'll type this in, then I'll explain it. Alright, so what does this mean? So you remember that with our create hitbox script, among the many different arguments that we passed, one was called knockback, right? And so we were determining if the hitbox was going to impart a force on the object that it hit, and then what the strength of that force was. Here, let me find this here. Create hitbox. There we go. Okay, so we passed right here. We have how much damage, and then we have this knockback one. Okay, and we are storing in the hitbox that gets created the amount of knockback. Okay. So if that knockback value has some number to it, it means it is going to cause the thing that the hitbox collides with to fly off in the opposite direction of the hitbox. Okay, so if the hitbox is coming from the left-hand side of the enemy and collides with the enemy, and there's some knockback, then what we want to do is have the enemy fly off toward the right, away from the hitbox at a certain level of strength. So what we're doing now is figuring out what direction it is we want the enemy to fly when it gets hit by a hitbox. And then essentially what we're doing is determining from which direction is the hitbox colliding with the enemy. Okay, so that's what we're doing. If I could spell this correctly, this shouldn't be direction, this should be point direction. We've used this before. And what we're saying is a knockback direction is going to contain an angle, basically, and the angle is going to be derived from a line between the hitbox and the enemy. Okay, and then we'll store that angle here. Finally, we're going to say set speed and direction. This is one of our movement utility scripts that does just what it says. It's going to set our custom version of speed and our custom version of direction of the enemy. And the speed is going to be knockback direction. Okay, I guess that's got to be this is probably an ill-named thing. If I take a look inside here, you can see the first argument is direction and the second argument is speed. So the order of these arguments doesn't match the name of the script. Oh, it's a badly named script. This should be set direction speed if I want to make it more logical. Okay, so this first argument is actually going to be the direction, and the second argument is going to be the speed or power. So we're going to look to the knockback value that lives on the hitbox and use that to determine how much force basically we're hitting the parent enemy with. Alright, that's a lot of explanation, but hopefully that all made sense. Right? And this is all, again, being set up on the parent so that when we create children, we can use all of this same code without having to write it, unless we want to override something. Now, right now, we don't have anything occurring for our hit state, so let's create that by going to add event, other, user event 0, and this is going to be our hit state. And what are we going to do in our hit state? This is, I hope, going to look familiar. We're going to cause our enemy to move. Now remember, this hit state, the transition to this hit state is when the enemy is hit by a hitbox. We switch into the hit state. And what do we want to have happen? Well, we want it to move. So we're going to move object true, and remember, true means is it going to bounce or not? Yes. And then we're going to say slow down. So it's going to move it, and then it's going to slide back to a halt. Okay. And the values that it's going to use for moving without having to go through all this kind of stuff again are the value that are in speed and direction, our custom version of speed and direction, which we just set a second ago inside this collision. That's what's happening right here. Okay. So it's going to move off in the direction going away from the hitbox at the speed that is inside the knockback value, and then it's going to slow down to a halt. So how are we going to get out of this hit state? Well, we're going to say if speed, our custom version of speed, is 0, then state equals starting state. And remember that our starting state was no one, meaning nothing. So the end result will be if we swing our sword, it hits the enemy is going to check to make sure it's able to be hit by that hitbox, and if it is, then it's going to bounce in the opposite direction of the hitbox and then come to a stop, and when it comes to a stop, it will return to its initial state, which is no state, so it'll just sit there and do nothing. To wrap up this part of the lesson, this is kind of a long part of the lesson, let's test this, all right? So even though this is an enemy parent and in the real game it won't appear out in the room, let's fake it. Let's give a sprite to this enemy parent, and come into our room. Come on, here we are, room. We already have a layer in here called enemy, so select that layer. And then grab your enemy parent object and drag it out of the room. I don't know what happened to my sprite there. I thought I gave it a sprite. Let's double check here. There we go. Okay. One more time, back into our room. Now you can see this guy is here. All right, and initially he shouldn't do anything. He should just sit there. Okay. Now, if I try this right now, it shouldn't be able to be hurt. And I wonder if you know why. Well, for one thing, there's an error. What have we got here? Fatal error on enemy parent. Variable enemy parent max health not set before reading it. Blah, 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 equals max health. Uh-oh, it's unhappy about something about our health. Let's double check. Max health equals 2. And why is it unhappy about that? Let's see. Max health equals 2. Oh, look here. Max health. And here I misspelled it. Heath. There we go. So those error messages are super helpful. They will let you know where to look to try to find the error. So now we come in here. If I come up to my enemy, he's just standing there. He's not in a state at the moment. And if I swing at him, nothing happens, even though I set all of that stuff up. Why is that? You know? It's like a mini quiz moment. Well, one of the things we're doing is we are checking to see this. If hurtbox object can be hit other, meaning this enemy. Okay? So what we need to do is go back to our player and into our attack state on the player, and way back to where, let me close our room to give ourselves a little more space, where we created our hitbox. We've got this array that lists all of the things the hitbox is going to be able to hit. So we need to add to that enemy parent. Now when we run the custom function that says can hurtbox can object be hit, something like that, it should work. So let's come up here. Ha! And you see the guy bounces in the opposite direction of where I'm going. And then he stops. Do you remember why he's stopping? That's because each time we hit him, we are reducing the health of that enemy by 1. And we said in our script, if the enemy's health is less than or equal to 0, exit. So if he's already been hit enough times so that his health is 0, there's no reason to detect this anymore. Hey, that's pretty cool. All right, we'll end this lesson here, and in the next lesson what we'll do is continue to update our enemy, moving into and creating a child enemy that will actually be the one that's in the room, not this one here. So to wrap this up on your own project, make sure to remove the sprite that's on this enemy parent, come into your room, and remove, go to the enemy layer, and remove the enemy, the parent enemy from the room.